There's something most people won't admit, but feel in silence. A strange tension, almost invisible, that rises the moment they hear a foreign accent, see a new neighbor from another culture, or watch the news about immigration. And it's not always hate. It's something deeper, more primal. It's fear. But not of the immigrant, of what they awaken, of what they reflect. Because here's a hard truth. We don't fear the immigrant because they're different. We fear them because they show us who we've become. In a society that's spiritually numb and emotionally repressed, the immigrant becomes more than just a person. They become a mirror, a symbol of effort, sacrifice, uncertainty, faith. Things we've buried under performance, comfort, and illusion. And so, we project our shadows onto them. Blame them for the economy, the culture, the collapse. But what if that blame is a distraction? What if the immigrant is not the threat, but the reminder of everything we've exiled inside ourselves? Carl Jung warned, "Whatever we refuse to integrate will haunt us from the outside." That's not just a psychological insight, it's a warning about the future. Because the more we reject the other, the more fragmented we become. Not just as a society, but as individuals. This video isn't about politics. It's about soul recognition. About how prejudice is often a disguise for repressed pain. And how your relationship with the outsider reveals the truth about your own inner exile. Ready to see what you've been avoiding? There's a strange discomfort many people feel when they encounter someone who doesn't belong. Not because that person has done anything wrong, but because their very presence reveals something buried. The immigrant becomes a mirror we never asked to look into. A living reminder of what we fear the most: instability, vulnerability, poverty, and the unknown. Society doesn't hate the immigrant for who they are. It fears what they represent. Beneath the surface, this fear isn't rational. It's psychological. Carl Jung warned that whatever we refuse to confront in ourselves will find a way to confront us from the outside. And often it wears the face of the stranger. Most people live with silent anxiety about their status, their survival, their place in the world. But they hide it well. They obey, work, perform. And just when they start to believe they've tamed their fear, something happens. Someone arrives who reminds them of what they've been avoiding. A man with tired eyes and foreign clothes, a woman with a strange accent, children who speak a different language at school. These aren't threats, they're symbols. They activate the collective shadow of a culture obsessed with success and terrified of decline. Instead of owning that fear, society projects it, and the immigrant becomes its unwilling scapegoat. Psychological projection works like this. We feel something uncomfortable inside, but we don't know how to hold it, so we assign it to someone else. It's how the mind tries to protect itself from collapse, but it's also how prejudice is born. When a country is in crisis, economically, politically, spiritually, it looks for something to blame, and instead of facing the broken systems, it chooses the visible outsider. That's why people say things like, "They're stealing our jobs," or "They don't share our values." It's not logic speaking, it's fear dressed up as patriotism, a fear that was always there, just waiting for a target. Jung believed that the more unconscious a society is, the more it needs enemies. Not because those enemies are real, but because they help preserve the illusion of innocence. If we believe that they are the problem, then we get to feel righteous, clean, safe. The deeper truth, though, is that every immigrant story reflects a part of us. The part that has struggled, the part that has hoped, the part that has been rejected. But instead of embracing that shared humanity, society builds walls, both literal and psychological. And in doing so, it cuts itself off from healing. Think about it. The immigrant often arrives with nothing but courage, desperation, and resilience. These qualities used to be celebrated. They were seen as noble. But today, they remind people of what they've lost, their own hunger to grow, to start over, to survive. So instead of admiration, the immigrant receives contempt. This isn't just injustice, it's projection. Because it's easier to mock what we've buried than to bring it back to life. In the immigrant, we see our own discarded soul, the one we left behind in our pursuit of comfort and control. In working-class neighborhoods, this dynamic is even more painful. People who already feel unseen and undervalued are told that someone else is taking their place. It's a cruel trick. Two groups, both struggling, are turned against each other, while those at the top remain untouched. The collective shadow grows deeper, more dangerous. It whispers lies like, "There's not enough for everyone," or "They're not like us." But the truth is, the system that exploits the immigrant is the same system that exploits the worker. And the moment they see that, everything begins to change. This is not about denying cultural differences or ignoring real challenges. It's about seeing what lies beneath our reactions. When you feel threatened by someone different, pause and ask, what part of me feels exposed? What fear am I projecting? What wound is being touched? The immigrant may not be your enemy. They may be your unacknowledged teacher, a symbol of all that you've forgotten to honor in yourself. Your endurance, your longing, your ability to begin again. To reject them is to reject your own story and your own chance to grow. Because the real question isn't, why are they here? The real question is, why are we so afraid of what they show us? Until we face the parts of ourselves that we've exiled, we will keep finding people to blame. And the cycle will never stop. But here's where things begin to shift, and where we dive deeper into the scapegoat mechanism itself. Who created it? How it feeds on our pain, and what it costs us every day. What do you think society sees in the immigrant that it refuses to face in itself? It starts quietly. A rising discomfort, a tension that no one wants to name. Bills piling up, jobs disappearing, neighborhoods changing. People feel squeezed by forces they can't control. Economy, automation, bureaucracy. But instead of confronting the chaos, society needs a face for the fear. That's where the scapegoat enters. Someone to carry the weight of everyone's silent frustration. The immigrant becomes that vessel, not because of who they are, but because of what society refuses to face. Carl Jung said, "The unconscious must be confronted or it will confront us as fate." And the scapegoat is that fate with a passport and an accent. Most cultures have used scapegoating as a psychological release valve. It's a way of converting collective pain into blame. When life feels out of control, humans instinctively look for someone different to hold responsible. It's primitive, but it works, at least temporarily. Politicians use it to rally support. Media uses it to sell fear. The crowd uses it to feel safe. And the immigrant, already carrying the burden of survival, is forced to absorb a trauma that was never theirs to begin with. It's not justice. It's psychological outsourcing, a cheap trick to avoid collective healing. You see this especially in countries facing identity crises. When a nation no longer knows what it stands for, it begins to define itself by who it's against. It builds walls, closes borders, and inflates nationalism, not out of strength, but out of collapse. It weaponizes memory, claiming to protect tradition, when in truth, it's protecting a fragile ego, one that can't tolerate discomfort or difference. The immigrant scapegoat becomes a shield for that ego. If they're the problem, then we don't have to change. If they're the threat, then we're the victims. It's a script as old as fear itself. What's even more tragic is how this dynamic plays out within the working class. People who've been betrayed by the system are told to blame others who are equally betrayed. A man in a small town loses his job to automation, and instead of blaming the billion-dollar company, he's told to blame a desperate family fleeing war. It's a diversion, a magic trick. And the pain of disempowerment is redirected sideways instead of upward. This keeps people divided. It prevents solidarity. Because if the poor ever stopped blaming each other, they might realize they were never the problem to begin with. This is how prejudice becomes profitable. Entire systems are built on keeping people blind to the real source of their suffering. And nothing sustains that blindness like fear. The immigrant is framed as a competitor, a threat, a danger to stability. But let's be honest, stability was already an illusion. Wages have been stagnant for decades. Healthcare is a privilege, not a right. Mental health is collapsing. People are exhausted, overworked, and underloved. But instead of seeing these conditions as systemic failures, society pins them on the nearest outsider. It's simpler and far more dangerous. Jung warned that the parts of ourselves we disown become monsters, and societies do the same. They bury grief, injustice, powerlessness, then project it onto the most vulnerable group they can find. That's why xenophobia often spikes after national trauma, after recession, after political unrest. The scapegoat absorbs the anxiety that has nowhere else to go. But in doing so, something precious is lost. Empathy. The ability to see the other as human. The ability to remember that pain doesn't have a passport. It just wants to be seen. And scapegoating is how pain hides. But pain that hides eventually festers. It turns into bitterness, into violence, into cycles that repeat for generations. Children grow up learning who to blame instead of how to feel. Adults pass on beliefs they've never questioned. And society becomes more fractured, more suspicious, more numb. The scapegoat may change faces, but the mechanism stays the same. Until someone breaks it. Until enough people say, "This is not the source of our suffering. This is not the enemy." And in that moment, truth cracks through the illusion. The pain is no longer outsourced, it's faced. And facing it is the first step toward healing, toward reclaiming ownership over what's been projected for far too long. But there's another layer here, one even more subtle, because the immigrant doesn't just reflect fear or threat. Sometimes they reflect something more sacred, the soul, the forgotten, exiled part of society that still believes in starting over. And that's exactly what we'll explore next. What if rejecting the immigrant is actually rejecting your own capacity for rebirth? And what happens when that rejection becomes spiritual exile? What part of you are you still trying to banish? Some truths are too painful to face directly, so we disguise them. We turn them into symbols, stories, or strangers. That's exactly what happens with the immigrant. Beyond politics, there's something deeper at play. The immigrant is not just a foreigner. They are the symbol of something society has exiled: the will to begin again, the courage to cross inner deserts, the longing for wholeness. In Jungian psychology, it may also be walling off its own forgotten self. Consider what an immigrant really represents. Displacement. These aren't just migration terms, they're soul movements. They mirror what happens during profound inner transformation. The journey from a shattered past into an unknown future. A leap of faith. But modern society doesn't value that anymore. It rewards conformity, not courage. Obedience, invention. They confront a world that fears its own potential for spiritual rebirth. Because if someone else is willing to risk everything for a new life, then what excuse do we have to stay stuck? In this way, a reminder that the immigrant's courage, shames us because it exposes how safe and how spiritually numb we've become. It reminds us that somewhere along the way, we gave up the fire. We traded passion for numbness, and every border we build outside reflects a prison we maintain inside. This internal rejection creates a nation of ghosts. People who go through the motions but feel empty, who scroll endlessly, consume passively, and avoid any question that might shake their illusion of control. And when something, or someone, arrives to challenge that numbness, it's labeled a threat. But it's not a threat. It's a call. The immigrant becomes that call, to remember, to feel, not just as individuals. A civilization that forgets its own soul needs an external reminder. And the outsider has always played that role, from prophets to poets to refugees. Carl Jung believed that the soul seeks integration, that all parts, even the disowned ones, must be embraced for true healing. But integration demands humility. It means listening to voices we've ignored, welcoming truths we've denied. And in many ways, that's what the immigrant forces us to do. To confront the reality that the systems we worship, profit, power, security, often come at the cost of humanity. The immigrant doesn't threaten our soul. They reveal that we've forgotten we had one, and that realization is uncomfortable. So instead of facing it, many reject the messenger. But when a culture silences its messengers, it silences itself. It becomes tone-deaf to its own suffering. It loses its imagination, its empathy, its resilience. The immigrant's story isn't just about escape. It's about faith. It's about believing in a better life, even when all signs say otherwise. That kind of faith is contagious, dangerous, and deeply needed. Because when people remember that new life is possible, systems of control start to tremble. And that's why the immigrant must be dehumanized. Not because they're weak, but because their story holds too much power. So here we are, a world filled with people seeking safety while carrying wounds they can't name, and a society that keeps building walls, not realizing it's isolating itself from its own redemption. But what happens when the soul gets tired of being exiled? When the repressed parts of us stop knocking and start breaking the door down? That moment is closer than we think. The image of the immigrant is no longer just an issue. It's a warning. And maybe an invitation. What do you see in the immigrant's eyes that your own soul might be asking you to remember? And maybe the deeper question is this: who or what have you exiled inside yourself just to feel safe? Because the moment you stop seeing immigrants as others and start seeing them as mirrors, you begin to walk a different path. Not of guilt, but of integration. Not of charity, but of recognition. And not of division, but of reunion. But to go there, you must cross your own inner border first. So what part of you have you been deporting in silence? And is it finally time to let it come home? Maybe the real borders aren't drawn between countries, but between parts of ourselves we've never learned to welcome. Maybe the walls we build outside only reflect the silence inside. The silence around pain, fear, lost dreams, and untold stories. The immigrant, then, is not just a figure in the news. They are a living question, a sacred interruption, a symbol of everything we've tried to forget about struggle, faith, and transformation. And the way we treat them, blame them, fear them, ignore them, might say more about our spiritual condition than our social values. So now the mirror is in front of you. What do you see? A threat or a reflection? A stranger or a part of you that's been buried? If society continues to project its fears outward, the cycle of scapegoating will never end. But if just a few people begin to look inward, if just a few choose to reclaim what's been exiled, something powerful starts to shift. Because integration doesn't begin with politics, it begins with perception. With one person seeing clearly what others are too afraid to feel. So ask yourself, what have you pushed away inside you just to feel accepted? Who have you blamed just to avoid your own reflection? And what would it look like to finally let that lost part come home? If this message stirred something in you, if it made you uncomfortable in a way that feels honest, don't let it fade. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay with this journey. Because it's not just about them, it's about all of us, and the soul we're still trying to recognize.